Hello and welcome to Cyrus Forum. My name is Mariam Memarsadeghi, and today we have a panel of esteemed advocates and experts on religious freedom and ethnic minority rights. Our topic is how to create an Iran that is democratic, that protects pluralism, religious freedom, and the rights of ethnic minorities. We have with us 5 people who have devoted their lives really to countering discrimination, persecution, and intolerance. Each one brings a wealth of experience focused particularly on one identity or one experience of persecution and intolerance and violence, including in Iran, but not limited to Iran. So we will begin with Taimoor Aliassi. What I will do is each person will have 5 to 10 minutes to speak. After each person speaks, I'll ask a question or two, and then all together, when everyone's finished, we will discuss together. And I will introduce each person before their talk. Our order is going to be Taimoor Aliassi, who represents the rights of the Kurdish ethnic minority in Iran. Then Simin Fahandej, who will speak about the Baha'is. And then Mr. Doshoki, who will talk about the Baluchis in Sistan Baluchistan province. Sharon Nazarian speaking particularly about countering anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews in Iran, religious freedom broadly, and Paul Marshall, who is a person focused, again, his entire career on persecution of Christians, but also religious freedom more broadly. I will introduce each person individually. As I mentioned, we will start with Taimoor Aliassi. So, and I want to thank each one of these people for devoting their time today to Cyrus Forum and to this discussion, and to all of you for watching and giving your attention to this important topic. Taimoor Aliassi is the UN representative of the Kurdish Human Rights Geneva, KMMKG. Mr. Aliassi is a Swiss citizen with a Kurdish background from Iran. The country left after the 1979 revolution. He studied at the Geneva Graduate Institute and obtained a Master of Advanced Studies in Humanitarian Action with a specialization in international law. As the co-founder of KMMKG, Taimoor promotes democracy, respect for human rights, and social development in Kurdistan of Iran and beyond. He is a vocal advocate at the UN and EU parliaments. He works to challenge all forms of discrimination, especially against people from ethnic and religious minorities in the region, advocating against the death penalty and promoting the rights of women and children. He also writes about the geopolitics of the Middle East, the role of the established and emerging powers in the region, and human rights issues, published in French, English, Kurdish, and Persian. In March 2014, Taimoor co-authored a book called On the Death Penalty in Iran, published by Ensemble contre la peine de mort. Taimoor John, we're all ears.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mariam John, for this important webinar, which is very meaningful to us, especially in this very sensitive time that Iran is passing, especially with the repression against minorities. First, I would like to express my deepest and emotional thoughts to Gina, to Nika, Sarina, and the 460 other protesters whose lives were taken by the regime security forces. My heart goes out to the 61 minors who had a whole life full of dreams, but killed by the Ayatollahs. My thoughts also go to Mohsen Shekari and Majid Raza Rahnoud, the latest 2 protesters who were hanged unlawfully by the Ayatollahs. So the current repression against Iranian protesters is a truly painful dimension of today's debate. Before highlighting some of these challenges that the minorities are facing in Iran, I would like to say a few words about the situation of Kurdish people in Iran that exemplifies the treatment of all other minorities in the country, in my opinion. So the causes and the scale of repression and violence in Iran against Kurdish people and other minorities are inherent to the inception of the Islamic Republic. In August 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini, Iran's then supreme leader, declared a holy war against the Kurdish people and framed the Kurds as anti-revolutionary and anti-Islam because they were simply for the establishment of a secular, democratic, and decentralized state in Iran. Since then, the Kurds are stigmatized, marginalized, and excluded from any participation in public life. And they are perceived and treated as a hostile group by Iranian state and state media. This hateful discourse is also reproduced by some of the Iranian diaspora and also media outside the country. So in practice, if we give some example, over 50% of Iran's political prisoners are Kurds. And this atrocity is justified by the state hateful and violent discourses, knowing that the most heinous massacres and genocide of our time were often preceded by hate speech. So, for example, since the nationwide protest started, according to our data, 460 people were killed, including 61 children and 32 women. 100 of these people, they are Kurdish, and another 145 are Baluchis. Baluchis and the Kurds make up over half of the number of the victims. Kurdistan is militarized. The prisons are full in Kurdistan. The protesters are detained in basement, and mass trials are undertaken by revolutionary cars. And often the bodies of those who are killed are enforcibly disappeared by the security forces, and the regime refuses to return to the families. So just give another example of how this multi-layered level of repression against the minorities in Iran. If you give the example of execution in 2022, at least 500 people were executed prisoners. And at this number, 245 are Baluchis and Kurds. And the Kurds and the Baluchis, they are simply make around 20% of Iran's 82 million population. Sorry. So this shows how the minorities, especially the Kurds and the Baluchis, are treated in the country. I would also like to touch 2 words about Iran's constitution, which is discriminative, anti-minority, anti-women, and anti-children. And I repeat this often. I mean, reading Iran's constitution is a mental torture. Article 1 says one thing, and the following article says a different thing. For example, Article 19 of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic declares that all the people of Iran, whatever the ethnic groups to which they belong, enjoy equal rights. But Article 1, 4, 12, and 15 of the same Constitution stipulate that the official religion of the country is the 12th Imam Shiism, and all laws must be based on this branch of Shia Islam. And only Persian is the official language of the country. So in law and in practice, a Baha'i, a Kurd, a Baluchi are excluded from any participation in public life. For instance, in the past 4 decades, not a single minister of Kurdish, or Baluchi, or Baha'i in the central government, and not even a single governor of Kurdish 4 provinces nominated were Kurdish. So that is the clear example of the discrimination in law, but also in practices that the minorities are treated. So in Iran, the system of governance is based on a logic of one country, one nation, one language, and one religion. For us as minorities, this slogan of one country, one nation, or one language, or one flag is equal to Adolf Hitler's ideology, which is ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. So this, in the reality, we know that Iran is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious country composed mainly of the Persians, of the Kurds, Baluchis, Azerbaijanis, Ahwazi, and Turkmen, and many others, and also of Baha'i, Yarasani, and Jewish, Christian, and many others. And we know that the civilized and democratic world are also heading towards more of decentralization, inclusion, share of power, and power to people. So we should end this kind of slogan and discourses, especially among our diaspora outside the country. Since 1979, Kurdistan has been pioneer in the fight to defy Ayatollah's rules and to promote values of a secular, democratic, federal Iran that fully respect women and minority rights. We have been bombarding this message ever since with the slogan Jen, Jian, Azadi, or women, life, freedom, that has now become the war chant of the protesters in whole Iran. Finally, I would like to end my talks with a quote station from Miss Ruya Takian, an Iranian-American New York-based author, who said, "The most worthy and qualified members of anti-regime coalition are the Kurds of Iran. They have been on the forefront of the fight for the freedom for decades. They have sacrificed indefinitely and continue to resist and to lead. And they gave the movement a face. Jina Mahsamini, Jen Jian Azadi, Zan Zindagi Azadi, woman, life, freedom." Thank you.
Thank you, Taimoor Aliassi. Question for you is about how much the Kurdish leaders, activists, recognized Iranians who are from the Kurdish minority have spoken about the need for national unity. Could you talk about that?
About the
national unity, about how we are all one nation, about unity of Iranians.
Well, despite the 40 years of the poisonous propaganda of the regime, accusing the Kurdish people of separatism and terrorists, the Iranian people, the Iranian ethnic groups, the Iranian youth show to the all Iranian, to the world, also to the Iranian diaspora, that the people of Iran, all of them, they are very solidar, they are very unified, and they are together in the suffering, but also in the defiance and the resistance against the regime. This message is also echoed and supported by all the Kurdish intellectual political parties and also diaspora outside the country. And I like to repeat one thing. The Kurdish people in Iran, the Kurdish political parties, has never wanted to seek arm or violence. It was never an option. It was always imposed by the central governments who do not accept to dialogue with the Kurds and find a peaceful solution to the Kurdish people in Iran. And the Kurdish movement, they have paid a huge sacrifice for their initiative and dialogues with the regime. We have seen the Vienna assassination of the Kurdish leaders Qasimlu in July 13, 1989 in Vienna with the so-called diplomats, tourists of Iranians. So the Kurdish people were always seeking with the central government to find a solution without Iran, but it's the regime who doesn't want it.
Great. Thank you again. Simin Fahandej is a representative of the Baha'i International Community's United Nations office in Geneva, having joined the office in 2011. She has served as a Baha'i International Community delegate to the Commission on the Status of Women, the Commission on Sustainable Development, and the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. She has also been involved with the major group for children and youth, including as editor-in-chief for the 7th Annual Youth Assembly at the UN. She has conducted research consultancies for various organizations such as Amnesty International, Noble Women Initiative, and Center for Defenders of Human Rights. Ms. Fahandej, prior to joining the Baha'i international community, worked as a journalist at various news outlets, including the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and she holds a combined honors degree in journalism and political science from the University of King's College in Canada, and a master's degree in international law from SOAS in the United Kingdom. Simin Can, we're all yours.
Thank you so much, Mariam Can, for inviting me to this panel with these distinguished speakers. I'm very, very happy to join. And this is really a great timing to be having this call, as in the midst of everything that's happening in Iran and the unrest and the repressive actions by the Iranian authorities against Iranian citizens. There have been, as you've seen, 2 Baha'i women, Mahvash Sabit and Fariba Kamalabadi, who had already served 10 years in prison for being Baha'is, together with 5 other Baha'is who were all part of this former leadership group of the Baha'i community in Iran that had actually been functioning in this capacity with the full knowledge and the full approval of the Iranian government ever since the government banned all Baha'i institutions in the country in the 80s. They have now, these 2 women have now been sentenced to another 10 years imprisonment for the same charges, which is absolutely cruel to really be putting their families through, themselves and their families through another 10 years imprisonment, and really shows in a way that there is no justice in Iran. There is no justice system in Iran when it allows 2 innocent individuals who had already served their terms unjustly to be serving another 10 years. I think that many people, both here on this panel and the viewers, are familiar with the persecution of the Baha'is and the history of the Baha'i, the human rights violations against the Baha'i community. But just to give kind of a background, again, Baha'is are Iran's largest non-Muslim religious minority, who have been systematically persecuted by the Iranian government for over 4 decades. And essentially since the Islamic Revolution in 1979, the government has really made it its official policy to discriminate against the Baha'i community. And in the early years of the revolution, over 200 Baha'is were executed, all because they were members of the Baha'i community. Many of them were told, choose between leaving the Baha'i faith, were told, choose between leaving the Baha'i faith and being executed. There was no really other choice given to them. Thousands of Baha'is in the early years of the revolution were expelled from universities and from employment. And since then, tens of thousands have been expelled, continue to be expelled, or not allowed to go to university or employment. And their cemeteries are desecrated, personal properties are confiscated, they're vilified in state and semi-official media and social media, in schools and other educational institutions. And as you might know, the Iranian constitution does not recognize the Baha'i faith as a religious minority in the country, unlike, for example, Christianity, Judaism, and Zoroastrianism. Of course, other religious minorities are persecuted as well. However, the Baha'i faith is not even recognized by the constitution as a religion in Iran. And the official nature of the policy of persecution against the Baha'is is really captured in a document, in a memorandum that that came to light by the UN, actually by UN Special Rapporteur in 1991, and it is signed by the supreme leader and the president of the time, and it essentially says that the government, and I'm quoting here, the government's dealings with the Baha'is must be in such a way that their progress and development are blocked. And so to think that a government would write and approve an official document that in it says that the progress of an entire community must be blocked is completely just shocking in today's society. And it also stated in this document that students must be expelled from schools, I quote again, if they identify themselves as Baha'is, and that Baha'i children should be enrolled in schools with a strong and imposing religious ideology in an effort to shatter their religious identity. And it even asked that the cultural roots of the Baha'i community outside of Iran also be destroyed. And so really these efforts of these over 43 years have really been to destroy the Baha'i community as a viable entity in Iran and also beyond, as we see, for example, in Yemen, where the persecution that has been imposed, the Baha'i community has really been at the instigation of Iran, and of course in other countries. And what we see in Iran today, you know, we've seen in these past few months this persecution, the recent executions, and really these violent actions against Iranian youth has really, in a way, is the extension of the persecution that we've witnessed in these over 40 years against the Baha'is and against other minorities, to the generality of Iranians. And you know, many people have always said that Iran's treatment of the Baha'i community actually serves as a litmus test for Iran's commitment to human rights in general. And so we see now in these few months that persecution and that treatment and those violations of human rights have now been extended to Iranians generally. And we know you know, if we look back in history, that governments that in a way persecute one group will end up persecuting others in the long term. And in fact, in the weeks prior to the current unrest, the persecution of the Baha'is really intensified, and we had 300 cases of persecution in just 1 month, just before the current unrest began. And so in you know, in a way, the Baha'is have always been part of this conversation about how to build a more just and more peaceful Iran. They have been part of this conversation in these 4 decades, and they have always stood by all Iranians and their call for justice and equality, both at international level and also in Iran. In these past over 4 decades, the Baha'i community has consistently called for human rights resolutions at the UN, international legal mechanisms at the UN, at the Human Rights Council, at the UN General Assembly, has worked tirelessly every year to pass these resolutions at the UN that addressed human rights situation in Iran generally. And as you might remember, last year, after particularly intensifying media hate campaign against the Baha'is in Iran, the Baha'i international community established a campaign called An Iran Without Hate, calling on Iranian authorities to allow Iranians to build an inclusive Iran where everyone, regardless of their background, ethnicity, belief, or gender, can live peacefully with respect and without fear of persecution and hate. And so we are very happy to be part of this conversation, and I look forward to the discussion later.
That's great. Question for you, Simin Can, is you mentioned that how the Baha'is are treated is a litmus test for the broader protection of human rights in Iran, and that the Baha'is have always stood with the rest of Iranians when they're demanding freedom. What is the Baha'i international community's position on the ongoing protests in Iran now?
Yeah, so I think the position of the Baha'i community was, I think you might have read or seen the statement that we had presented at the UN Human Rights Council special session on Iran, which is really condemning the actions of the Iranian government against its citizens, and it's really its call for justice and for equality. And we really feel that what's really needed is a conversation to be held by the Iranian government with its citizens to understand what they want and to build a just society the way citizens want, rather than really repressing these calls for justice.
Okay. Okay. Our next speaker is AbdulSattar Doshoki. He was born in Chabahar of Sistan Baluchistan province of Iran. Started his political activities in 1977 while a medical student in Tehran. He participated in the Iranian Revolution of 1979, but months later he became an ardent opponent of the Islamic Republic. He had to flee Iran and go to the UK, where he obtained his MD degree from Leeds University in 1989 and his MBA from the City University of London in 1991. 2 decades ago, Dr. Doshoki spearheaded the formation of a political coalition called Baluchistan United Front. He has written 2 books on Baluchistan and the Iranian opposition in exile. Dr. Doshoki is a prolific writer of articles about Iranian politics and appears frequently on various Persian language media outlets such as VOA, BBC Persian, and Manoto TV, as well as other TV and radio channels. He is currently Executive Director of the Center for Baluchistan Studies in London. Look forward to hearing your thoughts, Dr. Doshoki.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and I say hello to all the distinguished guests. And it is a privilege really to be among all these distinguished guests. As you mentioned in the first sentence of the introduction, I come from Chabahar, and I think very important point about Chabahar. Chabahar is, nowadays in Baluchistan, there are many cities, but Chabahar was the furthest city before the revolution from Tehran, and it's something like 2,000 kilometers. When Chabahar, when the divisions, the political divisions and geographical division of the country were done during the Qajar dynasty, Chabahar was not actually part of the Sistan Baluchistan province for simple reason. There was no access through land from anywhere in Iran to Chabahar. So Chabahar was part of what was called the coastal province, which is Hormuzgan now. But anyway, that is about Chabahar, and also Chabahar being one of the most prominent cities of Baluchistan, and Baluchistan being the most deprived part of the Iran. And I cannot find any single day that goes without an execution of a Baluch for a variety of reasons, on drug charges, on murder charges, on Maharibe or fight against the God charges. So, and I think my friend Taimoor mentioned about the grievances of ethnic minorities, including Kurd, Baluch, Arab, Azeris, Turkmens, and others. But I would like to concentrate really on the issue of the democracy in Iran, or democratic future of Iran, and particularly within this context, both within the context of this forum that we are in, and also within the context of the time where the Iranian revolution, I would call, particularly of the women and young, is ongoing. And within that revolution, as we know, particularly the Baluch and the Kurds have paid heavy prices for this. In Zahedan, as you may recall, on the 30th of September, more than 100 people were massacred by the security forces, and a few weeks later in Khash, another city, about 20 people were massacred. But anyway, what I want to say really are that the wounds are very deep, and I think within this context, let me find out if we can have a future democratic Iran within the context of what we have, the factors of ethnicity, religious, pluralism, and tolerance. And I think these are very, very important issues. If we can resolve the issue of ethnicity in Iran and ethnic rights, then I think we could be hopeful for a democratic future. My own impression, I think, as far as the religious right is concerned, that includes of Sunni, of other religion, I think that will be resolved. Every single Iranian that I know do agree on this point, that in future religion will have no say whatsoever in the Iranian society as a whole, or politics, religion would be primarily and wholly an individual matter. And therefore, this secular democracy, I should say, in Iran will be established. So it is a question of the rights of the ethnic group like the Baluch or the Kurds or the Arabs, Azeris and Turkmens and others, and whether the Iranian culture accepts a concept called pluralism or tolerance. And I think this is very important. Tolerance is not necessarily confined to, for example, accepting other ethnicity or other religion. Tolerance is a broader issue, whether you accept, for example, if your daughter within your household to be equal with your son, and if the freedom your son has got, the society, the same freedom your daughter will have, your sister will have. And these are issues which goes deep into the culture. And I think there is no point of people like us coming here, oh yes, there will be a free Iran, there will be a democratic, unless a democracy is built by democratically minded people, by those people who are tolerant inherently, not trying to be pretending to be tolerant or to believe in pluralism in front of the camera, whether it be on a TV, on radio, in a meeting or in a forum like this. My own impression is, and I have written about this, particularly about the Iranian opposition. These are the creme de la creme of those politically minded people, particularly those who are in the West, who have lived here for decades. Unfortunately, they are not. And as I mentioned about the Baluch and also about the Kurds, the wounds in the psyche of the Baluch people, of the ethnic group of people, is very, very deep. And let me be very frank, rather than paying compliment and trying to be unnecessarily hopeful about an issue which could be challenging in the future of Iran, and that is the way I have interacted, and I know very well the Baluch, the Kurds and Arabs and others, for a variety of reasons, and particularly because of the oppression, they are inward oriented. The Baluch, they look, for example, to the Baluch of Pakistan more than to other parts of Iran. It's the same with the Kurdish. They regard the Kurds in Iraqi Kurdistan or Syrian or Turkish Kurdistan as closer to them than other part of Iranian. Now, one may say, look, this is not accepted what you're saying because we are all one Iran. But let me go back to 42 years ago, 43 years ago, when the revolution came and then they drafted this constitution, a disgusting constitution. And I did speak against this constitution. I remember when I was in Tehran, a student, and it was shown on the Iranian TV at that. In that constitution, it says that the supreme leader, the president, can only be from Shiite. Therefore, the majority of Kurd, majority of Baluch and others who are Sunni, they cannot become president. And since then, not only the supreme leader and the president, which by the constitution cannot be elected because they are barred, disqualified. Many other discrimination against other ethnicity, including the worst of all, against the Baha'is, were done in the constitution. Overwhelming majority of the Iranian, of the Persians, went and voted for that constitution happily. This was 42 years ago. This was 42 years ago when they attacked Kurdistan, and we did a demonstration in Balochistan in support of Kurdistan. I know now, after 44 years of this revolution, a lot of Iranians have woken up and are against this regime, but they were not 42 years ago, unfortunately, for a variety of reasons. And therefore, these deep wounds are not wounds of even today or a few weeks ago when they massacred 100 people in Zahedan or in Mahabad or other places. So it is deep. And I think the other problem is, unfortunately, I think this is the first time we have such a forum, particularly on the ethnic and religious freedom and the future of Iranian democracy with regard to the ethnicity and religious freedom. Because the Western experts and the commentators tend to look at Iran, as always looked at Iran through the prism and eyes of the Persian elites. And the Persian elites is the Persian language, is the Shiite. And I had that argument with a lot of Persian elites over the last 2-3 decades. So therefore, as I said, the religion will be resolved. It will not be. The Baha'is will be as equal as Muslims and Sunnis and Shia. But one thing pains me as well, which is amazing. As I said, I'm not a Persian, but I always wonder. Every country you go, India is the Hinduism, you know, the Arab, Saudi Arabia is the Muslim. So every country where that religion comes, that religion is respected, is the main religion. Iran is the only country where two major religions, means the Baha'ism and the Zoroastrian, came from Iran. And they are oppressed. And an outside religion by some sort of occupant or occupiers are forced. So these are a lot of strange things about Iran and Iranian culture and what's happening in Iran going on. And I think within this matter of 5-10 minutes, I cannot express all of that. But it is very important that the ethnic issues have been politicized, have been polarized extremely by the Iranian regime, not only by the Iranian regime, but part of the Iranian society, those who are not Baluch or Kurd or Turkmen or Arab, do not understand, unfortunately, just like a lot of Muslims do not understand the Baha'is or Zoroastrian and others, because everybody is so occupied with their own pain and misery. I think this issue of ethnicity, which goes to the core of pluralism and tolerance, is very, very important, because when it comes to the ethnic rights, a lot of Iranians shudder, say, oh my God, are they going to have some sort of confederation? Are they going to be secessionists? Are they going to, you know, separate from Iran? But I think because unfortunately this issue has not been resolved, like what has been, for example, in America, in Canada, in many other countries where there are multi-ethnic groups who exist there. I know I have talked a lot, but as I said, this issue needs to go deep into and really sort of dissected in a painful way in order to understand and be sure that this issue will not be an obstacle for a democratic Iran in future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Doshoki. What do you, I guess the question I have for you is the same as I had for Taimoor Aliassi and in a way, Simin Fahandej. The protests in Iran cover every province, every city, every town, every ethnicity. Everybody is really, really remarkably united in their slogans. Considering how much the Baluchis have, the price that they've paid, including in the last 3 months with the massacre that you mentioned, ongoing executions, do you see that their sense of allegiance to a united Iran is stronger than ever now?
I think all of them have expressed that, and you see that on every Friday when thousands of the Baluchis come out from the prayer grounds, their slogan is, you know, from Zahedan to Tehran, I sacrifice my life for Iran. So there is no separatist or secessionist slogans or movement, and I think in this particular revolution, which I call it revolution because we tried to have evolution for the last 44 years. It did not happen. Iranian regime did not change through evolution. Iranian regime did not change through even reformation. So reformation, evolutions are out, and now we have got a revolution. And they are, and in Kurdistan, in Baluchistan, and other places. So at this stage, I'm saying all the Iranians are united as one nation, and it is clear in their slogans, it's clear in their fights. But having said that, the demands, the ethnic demands, the religious demands, they are still there. And unless we accept that Iran is a multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-plural and society, then the Iranians do not have agreement, unfortunately, on that one. What is the ethnic rights? They disagree on that. The Kurds and Baluch have a different version. Iranians, the Persians, I mean, have a different version. So, but we have a common enemy, which is the strongest enemy, and that is Islamic Republic of Iran. And I think they all recognize this fact that against this common enemy, they should put aside for the time being all the differences, which they have put aside, and I think rightly so, and they are fighting against the regime. But as I said, in the future, this challenge will come up because I have seen it 44 years ago, and I have been through that quite a lot.
Yeah, I think even in the Persian, what you call Persians, there is a real range of opinion on these subjects of pluralism and tolerance and ethnic minority rights and religious minority rights, and there's a lot of discussion. My hope is that Cyrus Forum is going to be a place where the discussion can advance and can be one where we continue to build on previous conversations to get to a place where we recognize the basics, that Universal Declaration of Human Rights and democratic political system will allow everyone to have their freedoms. Our next
my last sentence, I totally agree with you. A man who cannot create equality between his daughter and his son in the household cannot accept equality between the Baluch and the Persian, or between the Turks and Kurds and other Persians or Shia. So it is a cultural thing, which I think we need to work on.
It's a cultural thing, and that cultural challenge can exist among any ethnicity. There's no virtuous ethnicity over other ethnicities, which I think is what you're saying also. So our next speaker is Sharon Nazarian. She is an Iranian-born American social activist, academic, and philanthropist. Sharon, I wanted to ask you before, you're still with the Anti-Defamation League?
Actually, just as of August, I've stepped down from that post, but I do still use so much of my experience and data from ADL, so I will be referencing that in my presentation.
Great. She was previously Senior Vice President for International Affairs at the Anti-Defamation League. She joined that organization in 2017, had the responsibility of fighting anti-Semitism and racial hatred around the globe, including overseeing ADL's Israel office. In September 2019, she testified before a Joint House Committee hearing on the internationalization of the global white supremacy movement. In June 2019, she represented ADL in Mexico City, Mexico, where ADL and the Mexican Foreign Ministry signed an agreement to work together to protect people of Mexican heritage living in the U.S. who are victims of discrimination, bigotry, bullying, and hate crimes. She has also testified in January 2020 before the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom regarding global efforts to counter anti-Semitism. Her philanthropic work is very deep, as is her academic work. She's taught adjunct at UCLA Department of Political Science, is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and sits on a myriad of foreign policy boards, and I could go on.
That's perfectly sufficient.
Looking forward to hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mariam, very much. And I want to start by really commending the Cyrus Forum for helping us kind of really look at the building blocks of what a future free and democratic Iran might look like, and hopefully will look like. So really thank you, Mariam, and thank you to the Cyrus Forum for bringing this distinguished panel together. I'm really honored to be sitting with colleagues who've already touched on many important topics that I think we all have in common and we advocate for together. And I want to underline what's already been said multiple times. This Iranian revolution is one that has unified all Iranian people inside and outside Iran. So I think where the Jewish community is concerned, as a community that is quite small, at its height, the Jewish population of Iran right before the 1979 revolution was just under 100,000. Today, there's somewhere between 10 to 20,000 Iranian Jews left. And we as diaspora Jewry and diaspora Iranian Jewry feel very, very committed and feel the pain of the people of Iran. So in some ways, we're all Jian Mahsa Amani, and I can tell you that the Iranian community, the Jewish Iranian community here in Los Angeles, where I reside, and across the world, feel just as, feeling the pain and feeling the anger and frustration with what this corrupt and illegitimate regime is doing to its own citizens. I want to use this opportunity to educate a little bit the audience about kind of the vision of the Jewish community vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic of Iran, and why we as a people have felt that this regime has been really immoral in its treatment of all minorities. And of course, you've heard from the Baha'i community and the ethnic communities, the Kurds and others, who really have paid a heavy price in terms of life and death. But today, according to the US State Department and the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League is the oldest and most respected anti-hate organization that fights anti-Semitism around the world, as well as other forms of hate. You heard from my bio that I have advocated on behalf of all kinds of vulnerable minority communities around the world. But according to ADL and the State Department, the Islamic Republic of Iran is the #1 state sponsor of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial around the world today. There is no government that doesn't espouse more anti-Semitic rhetoric and behavior than the Islamic Republic. And a big part of that is the denial of the Holocaust. So this puts this regime in a unique category all by itself. In February 2021, my team at ADL conducted a comprehensive survey of Iranian state textbooks, where we exposed that students in Iran over the past 40 years have been taught blatant anti-Semitism, hatred and incitement to violence against America, Israel, and the Jewish people, and have been taught that Jews have essentially conspired against Islam from its earliest days, forging Islamic scriptures, using warfare, and even Freemasonry to achieve evil aims. This regime is known for holding Holocaust cartoon contests. 3 times now it has held what they call international Holocaust cartoon contests, simply aimed at the denial of Holocaust. And the last one was held in 2021. And they get submissions from around the world using political cartoons to message and question the veracity of the World War II Holocaust that killed over 6 million Jews and many others. So I have to say that this kind of dehumanizing propaganda is one that all of the groups represented on this panel have suffered from and continue to suffer from under the hands of this regime. In the case of Jews, obviously using the Jewish community as a way to delegitimize and demonize the state of Israel is also a unique character. The Jewish citizens of Iran, while being considered a protected group, continue on a daily basis to pay the price and feel the vulnerability of at any moment being accused of being a spy or conducting espionage for the state of Israel. Jews in Iran today have to go out in protests and are forced to chant death to Israel, death to America. And therefore, it is the vulnerability of the Jewish community is the one of being between a rock and a hard place. Their citizenship is questioned, their patriotism is questioned, and at any moment, they can be accused of being a spy for another country, and namely mostly Israel. I want to reference another very important human rights activist, Mariam Memarsadeghi, who is herself Iranian-born. She recently testified before the U.S. Committee on International Religious Freedom, and she talked about how Iran's minorities are used as propaganda tools for the regime in a way to kind of promote a facade of tolerance and acceptance. But the real existence of our minorities are very different, and Jews are specifically used in that way. So the regime points to the fact that Jews can practice their religion, they can drink wine as part of our religious ceremonies, our synagogues are open, and yet the reality is the vulnerability, the insecurity of any moment being taken to jail, as 3 Jews were just done so 2 weeks ago, and being accused of being a spy. That's just a reality that Jews have had to contend with for over 40 years. Obviously, surveillance, control, and lack of resources. These are all commonalities that I think all faith and ethnic groups in Iran suffer from. Now, blaming Israel as an age-old tactic of these current uprisings is, again, this tool that this regime has used over and over again. Blaming the Zionists, blaming America, intervening in internal Iranian affairs is one that obviously nobody buys anymore. And thankfully, both the people of Iran and the international community has called out this regime for continuously pointing the finger outwards and not recognizing that its own citizens are the ones that are asking for regime change. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about the needs of democratic societies when it comes to the protection of minorities. And obviously my work at ADL really gave me a very important lens into how minority communities are treated and protected, especially in democratic societies in Europe, in Latin America. And what does it take to really feel that a pluralist democracy is functioning properly? Obviously, judiciary and laws are really where you need to start with, and law enforcement has to be there to carry out those laws. Representative leadership from communities that have really a credible voice. Now, we know that today in Iran's parliament, there are token representatives of different faith communities and ethnic communities, but those voices we know are so repressed, so threatened on a daily basis that there is no real representation there. And I can tell you that from traveling and visiting Jewish communities in other Muslim majority countries like Morocco, there's lots of good practices and best practices to learn from. Now, Morocco is maybe something for Iran to aspire to. It is not a perfect bastion of democratic representation and democracy, but I can tell you that the messages from King Mohammed of Morocco to the textbooks and the content that that educators in Morocco teach their future generations, to the legal protections that exist. These are some of the practices that we as Iranians can point to in Muslim majority countries and how minority communities might be protected. But more than anything, democratic institutions have to be strong in themselves in order to protect minorities. For minorities to be treated as full citizens with full protection, if democratic institutions that exist are not legitimate, are not highly functioning, it does not matter how each different ethnic or religious minority is being treated. And we can say that about the country I live in now, in the United States. The biggest threat to minorities in America today is the threat to America's democratic institutions, to its Supreme Court and judiciary, to the separation of powers. And so I think having this ideal of Iran becoming a pluralist, democratic and free state has to first start with this clear idea of what a democratic country, what its institutions need to be, what those pillars are, and how to make sure that the separation of state and religion is part of that ideal. And therefore, the focus needs to be right now on a democratic and free Iran. Thank you.
Thank you. I feel like I was hearing myself talk there a few times. we are like minds, and I'm just so happy to hear you speak. The institutions is something I believe in strongly, and that's why I founded the Cyrus Forum, is that without the creation of durable institutions that have democratic integrity, human rights talk is just going to be talk. Those institutions have to function, and they have to be all together creating the rule of law and creating the norms and the culture, I think, as Dr. Doshoki was talking about, of understanding and mutual appreciation. Because we have the history that we have, especially in the early years after transition, it's going to be very important to be able to talk about the truth of the past, to be able to teach it. For example, these Holocaust cartoons that the regime currently has, it's going to be important to teach children about why that was so harmful a practice, why it is that not all forms of expression further tolerance and pluralism, and that the regime cut off all kinds of discourse, but only allowed this hateful one about the Jews. Sharon, what do you think, what would be your advice to Cyrus Forum, really? Because we've taken on this mission of building, at the very least, the kinds of discourse like we're having today about the future. What advice do you have? Because you're also somebody who is an institutional person. You know, you've worked at the ADL at a leadership level, and you're involved with philanthropic work at a deep level. What do you think Cyrus Forum should be doing?
Look, as I said, I commended the mission of the Cyrus Forum. I think you're doing exactly the right thing. You know, envisioning the day after this regime falls is critically important, and we see very little of that, unfortunately. I think the opposition groups around the world today are all very much focused on elevating the issue, making sure the media doesn't forget it, bearing pressure on their governments. I think I want to commend really the diaspora Iranian communities where, you know, in 2009, we were all cheering in some ways and hoping that some reform could come. Today, the diaspora Iranian communities around the world, in Canada, in Europe, in the US, in Australia, are really a force. And we are all, you know, calling on our adopted governments to show up right now and to give the support. But what I don't see enough happening is a real planning and articulation and strategizing about the day after.
Exactly.
I don't see us coming together, you know, and putting our own individual or communal or religious differences aside and really envisioning what a democratic Iran should look like, what are the needs to build up to that, because we saw in 1979 what happened. That revolution was hijacked, and you have people on this panel who know it much better than I do, that if we don't have clarity in terms of what a pluralistic democratic Iran needs to look like before this regime falls, then it's too late.
Right.
And we know that there are other forces and other opposition groups who are organized, who have been planning for this, and who have a very strong narrative of victimhood. And I am very worried about organizations and groups such as Mujahideen Khalq coming in and really usurping kind of this voice of the freedom-loving and democratic-seeking people of Iran who are asking for democracy. So I think we have to be unified in our vision and have clarity about what that's going to look like.
Yeah, so true. Our last speaker, Paul Marshall, is going to help bring all these pieces together because he's one of the world's leading experts on religious freedom. Paul, I've known Paul Marshall for more than a decade. He and I both, at one point in our careers, worked at Freedom House. He was with the Center for Religious Freedom that was housed at Freedom House, and I was managing the Middle East, North Africa portfolio of programs, and I've always been honored to know Paul. He is a Senior Fellow at Hudson Institute's Center for Religious Freedom, and he is also the Wilson Distinguished Professor of Religious Freedom at the Institute for Studies of Religion at Baylor University and a research professor in political science. He's the author and editor of more than 20 books on religion and politics. It's a very long list. I'm not going to read it. He is the author of several hundred articles, and his writings have been translated into a huge list of languages I'm not going to read. He's in frequent demand for lectures and media appearances, including ABC, CNN, PBS, Fox, British, Australian, Canadian, South African, Japanese broadcasting corporations, and Al Jazeera. He has been published in pretty much every important newspaper. And as I mentioned, Paul has focused very much of his career on the persecution of Christians around the world, but he is a leading expert on religious freedom, if not the leading expert on religious freedom around the world. Thank you for joining us, Paul, and we're all ears.
Mariam, you're also on mute, I think, but Paul, I think you're on mute, sorry.
On mute, Paul, sorry, and I was too.
Okay, Mariam, thank you very much for organizing this panel and for inviting me to be on it. Thank you also for the very kind introduction. I'm not sure I will fulfill your promise of tying all of these things together, but I'll try and give some general themes. I think the first thing I'd want to emphasize is that religion is important. I don't think the members of this panel need to be convinced of that, nor the people of Iran, but often in the West, there is still the idea that religion is an epiphenomenon. When something appears to be religious, it's really something else. We must look at the deeper economic or political divide. So first thing I want to emphasize is that religion does not always dissolve into other interests. The second thing would be a qualification of the first, which is religion often overlaps with ethnicity. There's a large overlap with that in Iran in terms of who is Sunni, who is Shia, and also religion can indeed be a mask for other things. As again, I want to emphasize it's not always so, perhaps not usually so, but it can be so, and I think we're seeing that in Iran now. Amongst the elite, there were no doubt committed believers, but we have a highly corrupt religious and very wealthy religious elite. So it seems for many of them, it's doubtful that their religious expressions are their primary motive. But for the history of the Islamic Republic, without genuine sort of religious sentiment in the population, it's doubtful whether it could have come into power. There was the huge surge of demonstrations and probably would not have continued in power until now without being able to draw on Shia religious sentiment within the population. Its power is also now more basically based in repression, but for over the last 40 years, it has been able to draw some sense of legitimacy from the religious beliefs of the population. That's a very broad overview of some of the dynamics there. I think one of the things we've seen in recent decades is that due to the regime itself, that religious sentiment has weakened. In very simple terms, it says if this regime says it represents Islam, well, I can't stand this regime, so the next step for many people is, well, I'm out of Islam. So we see a great growth of atheism and agnosticism within Iran. And also, I think there's an increase in Zoroastrianism and certainly an increase in Christians. And Christians can be divided very broadly into two categories: the traditional communities, Assyrians, Armenians, and but now you're getting the very extensive growth of Farsi-speaking Christians, which means they're ex-Muslims. So and those numbers are now, there's enough external studies, those numbers are in the hundreds of thousands now. So, and again, talking to some of those leaders, they say, well, our church is growing because of the regime. People turn away from that and they associate that with Islam, so they turn away from that too. So that's happening. And that's also meant for these communities of Farsi-speaking Christians, they have been heavily repressed, and as with the Baha'i, even in recent months, even before the demonstrations began, increased repression of those communities. So one of the things which, let me also emphasize, and as I say, all my fellow panelists would know these things, but apart from this, say Baha'is or Christians or Zoroastrians, we've also mentioned the fact that Sunnis are repressed. In that sense, Sunnis are the largest religious minority in Iran. And also the division within Shia of heavy repression of Sufi orders, and then Shia who disagree with the government. The regime that Khomeini brought in is still very unusual in Shiite history. And again, the panelists will know this, but I hope it's useful for the wider audience. That the idea that a religious teacher, a grand Ayatollah, should actually be running the state is a novel thing. And many senior Shia scholars have disputed this. And for their work, they've been thrown into prison, or many of them are now in exile. So that the religious repression also exists within the Shia community itself. There are major divisions there. But I think these particular factors, those divisions, what's happening with the minorities, the attempts of the state to associate itself as the essence of Islam, I think they have weakened it. Those one of the many factors weakening its base, which I think is a factor which has helped these demonstrations to grow. And just one thing, in incidents last week, that attacks on Jewish, Christian, and Hindu holy sites in Iran. Confess my ignorance, I didn't know there were Hindu holy sites in Iran before last week. But again, I think these are at the hands of the regime. What might this mean for the future? I think all of us have firstly emphasized the importance of institutions, of having solid institutions, well thought out institutions, to maintain a plural and democratic country. And two elements of that which overlap. One would be I would express it this way: the insistence that civil or political status is independent of religion. I think that's one of the key elements here. Your ability to vote, to be part of the government, or other factors such as marriage, inheritance, property ownership, education, all the features of civil status have to be independent of religious status. This also ties in with the religious freedom. There's been, particularly in the last 15, 20 years, pretty intensive studies of the relation of religious freedom to other human rights and to other goods. One thing which holds up fairly well is if you deny religious freedom, you get religious conflict. States often say, well, we need to control these people, otherwise it'll burst out into conflict. In extreme situations, it might. But in nearly every case, when there is religious repression, you start to get a revolt against that, and you start to get an increase in violence. And Iran itself has shown this. Religious freedom also correlates very well with the status of women, with economic growth, and with freedom of the press and human rights generally. So obviously religious freedom is important for its own sake. It is wrong that people suffer simply for what they believe, but there are also pragmatic reasons why it's important. It becomes an important lever for many of the other things that we are seeking. And just my last comment would be the simple one, and this applies to the Kurds and the Baluchis as well. To the degree that all of these minorities are brought into working in developing a new Iran, you simply have more people on your side. If there's going to be divisions, there'll always be some divisions, obviously, but if there's going to be divisions, that simply reduces the number of people who are going to work together to build these new institutions. So, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. As always, I learned so much from you. Instead of asking you a question, I'm just going to open it up to everybody, but I'm hoping that, Paul, you're going to step in and talk a little bit more about how and why it is so pragmatic also, aside from moral or ethical, or it's pragmatic to have religious freedom because it builds so many other freedoms and keeps conflict away. I would like you to all think about questions that you have for each other, but I'll start with one, and maybe I'll ask Simin to talk about it. At the international level, Simin, you've been very active, and unfortunately, because of the nature of things inside of the country, people who are advocating for religious freedom or the rights of ethnic minorities have almost no avenue to advocate for those rights other than at the international level. What have you found, Simin Can, to be most effective so far? And I ask for many reasons, but one of them is for Cyrus Forum to learn about the kinds of things that we can build on quite literally, as we build the future for Iran. What has worked at the international level and that we can take and bring into our own, domestic level democratization?
Thank you, Mariam John. So I think everybody here on this panel is definitely very familiar with perhaps how the international level effort and advocacy works. But essentially, I think at the international level, of course, you have different mechanisms available for calling for religious freedom. There's resolutions that you can call for and you can support and seek their passing. I don't want to get into kind of the technicalities of everything at the international level, but I think, in my opinion, the most effective way to call for religious freedom is through conversations such as this, and it's through conversations even at the international level. It's all about conversations. It's about and the type of conversations we are having. And I think what the space that you have created here is one such way, which to bring people from different groups together to really have a very constructive conversation about whatever the topic is, and particularly about religious freedom. As Paul was saying, I think it's one of those sensitive topics where there's a lot of opinions, there's a lot of controversy, there's a lot of people against it and for it. And I think when it comes to religious freedom, I think creating the right type of spaces at the international level, at the local level, and at the national level, I think is very effective. And I don't mean just any type of conversations. I mean the type that are constructive, that lead to unity of thought and unity of vision, the type that really bring voices together, not, to harmonize these voices rather than put them against each other.
Mariam, if I may follow up, I just want to add another pragmatic, as a political scientist, that's kind of the way I look at the world. And And look at what happened to the European Union, European Parliament after it was divulged that this regime is selling drones to Russia that is now being used against civilians in Ukraine. I can tell you that, in 2017, 2018, I would go to Brussels and talk about Iran's minorities, ethnic, religious minorities, and I hardly had any MEPs interested in talking to me. Literally, there was no interest. And, Simin is smiling because you all know the reality. This is what you do every day. I don't do this every day. But I was really stunned to see that the European Parliament, which calls itself the bastion of kind of protection of human rights, had absolutely no interest. And at that time, and still until this war between Russia and Ukraine, it was all about JCPOA. And today, it's a different story. Pragmatically, Europe can no longer ignore the threat of Iran, the fact that Iran is essentially hooked its wagon to Russia, the biggest threat right now to the European continent. And so I think all of us, of course, our vantage point is through the lens of religious freedom and tolerance and human rights, but we also have to be pragmatic. And I think using this moment where Iran and Russia are essentially in the same bucket, aligning with each other, selling arms to one another, enabling one another, is the moment at the international level, at the European level, to put the screws on this regime and get the governments to actually step up and do something. Not just talk, but actually do something.
Talking of the European Parliament, can I just say my experience as well? It was only a few months ago, I think Elias was with me as well, in the European Parliament, and we were supposed to meet some of the Iranian committee, the part of the European Parliament who work with the Iranian Parliament as well. None of them wanted to come and see us, and we were quite a lot of people from the Iranian background. So from that day, I wrote 1 or 2 articles, and I made some TV interviews as well about this, that they are, I shouldn't use very nasty or rude words, but they were really not interested in human rights and things like that at all. And I have, in that respect, I must say, it's not very political of me to say that, but I have very little regards of the European Parliament at that time. And today I heard that many of them have been, sort of filling their pockets with the Qatari dollars. So yes, that is the problem. And I mentioned the European Parliament because Elias can expand on that. But having said that, right now, the protesters in Iran are being executed. There are more than 18,000 young people in jail, and people are being killed by the Iranian regime. And all the Western countries can do is sanction the police officer of a city called in Iran, will not give him a visa. This is a joke. This is a joke. If you are serious really confronting the Iranian abuse of human rights in such a gross scale, you have to kick out some of the ambassadors. You have to de-escale your diplomatic level with Iran, but they are not doing that sort of thing at all. So I'm afraid as an Iranian, I'm sure many other Iranians would say that as well, we are left alone to our own devices to fight in the street and to get killed and get arrested and then get tortured in the prison, while the West, for example, with regard to the Ukraine, has a different approach. Even with regard to Venezuela, had a different approach. They recognized Guaido as the president and not the current president of Venezuela. Even with Syrians, they recognize the Syrian opposition groups as the legitimate government. But when it comes to the Iran, it's just lip service. I think in that context, unfortunately, the actions, or rather, I should say, inactions of the European countries and United States and Canada deserves criticism. And this comes from many Iranians I hear and I read. And I'm not quite sure how many more minutes we have, but unfortunately, at 3:45 Washington time, I have a TV interview. So I will stay around 10-15 minutes.
Okay, well, I think that you mentioned Taimoor, but maybe we can just go to Paul Marshall, because Paul, can you say a bit more about the pragmatism? I mean, it's something I talk about a lot about, you know, it's even though I studied political theory, when it comes time for Iranian politics, I just try to really focus on, can we get practical here? Can we get pragmatic? What is it that we do agree on? They're so obvious, and the most fundamental things we do agree on. Could you talk just a bit, Paul, and then maybe we can close on that, unless Taimoor or others want to speak. Other countries' experiences going from very authoritarian or totalitarian to a democratic state, or even if it's not fully democratic, but one where religious freedom, ethnic minority rights are respected. What are the key takeaways? Are there things that those transitions have in common, in your view?
Okay, one of the things is, and this isn't sort of religion specific, but I think we know it, you know, the transition period of democratization, the early years are often very troubling. You know, it's unusual to go very smoothly and suddenly we have this democracy. Transitions are very difficult. They can backslide and they can get worse. But things I would emphasize just on the religion side is, again, aiming to make political and civil status religion independent. But take religious sentiments seriously. I've found this. I usually shy away in the international context from the word secular, because I've learned in the Arab world that sort of translates as godless, and there aren't many, you know, Muslims who are saying, "Oh yeah, I want a godless country."
Iranians do.
Yeah. But it's the association with Turkey under Ataturk and so on. So there's a sort of an aggressive secularism as an ideology. So so that could be misunderstood. I stress on a plural society, a free society, an open society, and that's why I use this particular formulation about religion. The society needs to be open to that, but what happens to you is not conditional on your religious beliefs or your religious identity. In terms of the other points, I simply mentioned apart from the status of women. By the way, the status of men improves as religious, in terms of income levels, increases with religious freedom, but not as much as with women. So men get better off, but women get quite a bit better off in more religiously open societies.
It comes back to Dr. Doshoki's point, and when there's tolerance, there's tolerance. It typically is all kinds. It's sort of like when you're a nice person, you're probably a nice person generally. Yeah. Not just to some people.
And there's the stress of that question of respect for the other person.
Yes, exactly.
It doesn't mean you've got to have to agree with them, but you need to respect them and recognize that, for me, before God, but also before the government and before any other institution, you are equal. So I think those themes are there, and emphasis on religious freedom tends to bring those out. And there was the old, when in the Catholic Church there were disputes about this, the argument against full religious freedom was that error has no rights. A thing which is wrong cannot have rights. To which the reply is, no, error can't have rights, and we're not saying they are. We're saying people have rights. Mm-hmm. And people may be in error, but that's the way it is. But the stress is very much on the status of people. And your main discussion now is the question of the dignity of the human being, and how that underlies all these themes of human rights. So these, I think, I'm the only person on this panel of non-Iranian background. So there are, you would all have a feel for Iran, which I would not. But I think the themes I've mentioned would carry over there, and
Yes.
the ones I would like to see emphasized.
It's critical that it's the individual that has rights, not groups or faiths or identities. Because, well, for many reasons, that needs to be the unit that holds the rights and the responsibilities in a democracy. Taimoor John, I'm going to give you the last word.
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, my experiences have been at the UN for the past 20 years, and also doing a lot with the EU Parliament and the United States. What I understand, the European and Western elite want a kind of they adopt a kind of containment policy toward Iran, and they want to change the policy of Iran, but they don't see the Americans. They are not convinced to change the regime. So unless we have some Western countries who are convinced that Iran is better without Islamic Republic, that they're convinced that Islamic Republic will not end its nuclear project of bombs and others unless he will be there. I mean, and for the Iranian inside the country, what is very important for me, the message is really, as you said, tolerance is talking together, is dialogue, negotiation. I mean, you have the Yalasani, the Kurdish Yalasani faith followers who are also suffering from discrimination from the state, after maybe the Baha'is, and they use people who go to military, they have to cut they cut their mustache. I mean, it's a ritual, they keep the mustache. So what is important for me is really talking with the Iranians and creating kind of atmosphere of tolerance and dialogue among us. This is the most important, that the Iranians work together on these issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. I hope that each one of you will continue to work with Cyrus Forum on this important topic. I'm very grateful for your time. I'm grateful to the people who are watching this program and are committed to this value of tolerance and pluralism. And thank you all so much again for making the time to be here. Okay,
thank you very much for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.